what I'm going to do in the next 1.5 hours is talk about social choice. And I'm going to start at the very basic notions of ethics and equity and justice. The reason that I do this is essentially twofold. One, environmental economics is part of public economics. It is about what should the government do. It's very normative, so you better have an idea about what is good and what is bad, right? So that is what I'm going to do. And the reason that I have to do it is essentially this has been ignored in your education so far, right? You just jump into utilitarianism and that's it. So I'm going to take the bottom out of this. This is where we are. Lecture 1. So environmental economics is all about the allocation, distribution and use of environmental resources. And some of these questions are positive. What happens if we put on a carbon tax? How much would CO2 emissions fall? That's a positive question of prediction. But another question is, of course, normative. How high should the carbon tax be? Right? And that, of course, depends on your notion of what is good and what is not good. Now, basically, all of the economics that you've seen to date follows a utilitarian ethic, which works fine within economics. The problem with utilitarianism is that it's not universally accepted, or rather it is almost universally rejected. Very few people buy into this. And as soon as you start to do applied economic analysis, including applied environmental economic analysis, and you sort of go out into the world and you meet people who are not economists, which I hope you will do, you are confronted with the fact that as an economist you have a very peculiar worldview. So you should at least be aware of this, right? So what I'm going to do is talk about 3 fundamental schools of ethics. That's naturalism, that's libertarianism, and that's utilitarianism. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about utilitarianism and its discontents. And then after an hour or so, I'm going to switch gears and talk about sustainability. So you can't talk about ethics without talking about Immanuel Kant. Here you see him. Kant is a very strange position in philosophy. Every philosopher will tell you that they're absolutely in love with Kant, right? That he is the greatest philosopher of all time. Some would say Hegel is, but most would have a clear affinity for Kant. But then when you ask them, but what did he actually say? They get into enormous disputes. And the best conclusion, I think, after centuries of studying Kant is that the conclusion is that the man couldn't write, because people are still arguing about what he wrote when what he meant when he wrote those books. But he did do 2 things that seem pertinent and can be attributed to him and are reasonably clear. And the first of those is the introduction of the moral agent. It's essentially the lowest unit of analysis of any ethical system. It's a bit like an economic agent. That is how you build up your theories, or you can think of it as an atom, or perhaps a quark. That is how you build up your physics, right? That is the basic building block. More importantly, is he introduced the rule of universality. It essentially means that if a rule applies to one moral agent, it applies to all moral agents. So if I'm a moral agent and you are a moral agent, and I argue that you cannot chop off my arm, which I think is a good rule, then the implication is that I cannot chop off your arm either, right? Which follows from the fact that both you and I are moral agents, and I declare these rules that should apply to me, then this rule should also apply to you. Now this is very similar as the Christian do not unto others what they, but it's a bit wider, a bit more general, right? Other than that, I'm not going to talk about Kant, right? So in naturalism, that's the first school. I'm surprised because here we have Bentham. The first school of ethics I'm going to talk about is naturalism. And the reason that Bentham is here is not because he's a naturalist. So what Bentham did, Bentham is essentially the father of utilitarianism, and Bentham argued that the government should strive to do the greatest good for the greatest number. Now we think of utilitarianism and we think of Bentham as right-wing, because he did not care about income distribution at all, but he just said we should just add up the utility of everybody and try to maximize the sum total, and it doesn't matter whether the rich get richer as long as the poor don't get poorer, that is fine, right? But that is through our eyes, that Bentham is fairly right-wing. In his time, he was a left-wing radical, because essentially the greatest good for the greatest number in the English context at the time meant that the government should care for the poor. Not just for the landed classes and the nobility and the people in the House of Commons, which at that time was not populated by commoners, right? But by the landed gentry and the industrialists, whereas the House of Lords was occupied by the nobility, as it no longer is, right? But at that time, only when you were very rich were you allowed to vote and were you allowed to sit in the House of Commons. And Bentham argued, no, the government should care for all white men, right? That's essentially what he said. Which was radically left-wing at the time. And going back to the moral agent and the rule of universality, essentially Bentham put us on a very slippery slope, because science and philosophy until that time, and actually until much later, was done by rich white men. And Bentham was the first rich white man to say, perhaps we should also care about poor white men. When he sort of expanded this notion that it's not we give rights to people who are not like us. And that set us on a very slippery slope. And things changed, right? The first thing perhaps that changed was the discovery of women, right? That perhaps voting rights should be extended to people with different chromosomes than us rich white men have. And then, oh my God, there's people with different skin color, right? And perhaps they're human as well. And perhaps they should have human rights. And by now you're sort of like no longer saying, well, the only moral agents are people who look like us, because of course philosophy is still dominated by rich white men, right? But we should also perhaps extend rights and duties to people who are not like us. But then where do you draw the boundary? Because we already said that the amount of money you have in the bank is not a valid criterion for being a moral agent, and the chromosomes you have is no longer a valid criterion, and your skin color is no longer a valid criterion. So what do we define by a moral agent? And people said, well, perhaps these moral rights and duties, and definitely the rights, extend to higher animals. animals that have, a higher animal is an animal that has a sense of self, that knows the difference between it and its environment. And if you put an elephant in front of a mirror, it recognizes itself, and in that sense it's just like a human being, right? And perhaps we should extend rights to higher animals. And most of us would agree to this, right? Definitely there's been strong laws against cruelty against animals. I sort of started with the example, I don't agree that you can chop off my arm, and I guess that most of you would agree that you can't go and chop off the leg of an elephant. That would be an immoral thing to do. The reason for that is perhaps because, like us, an elephant would recognize that this is being done by somebody else on the elephant, right? And this is not a crazy thought to most English people. It's also extended into law at the moment. There was a judge in Argentina not too long ago, last year, who argued, well, you can't lock up people without trial, so why can you lock up a gorilla? The animal has done nothing wrong, so why is it being held captive? And that is a real ruling by a real judge in a real court. But the argument here, or the dividing line between moral agents and other things, is the notion that you're able to recognize yourself when you know where you end and your environment starts. Is that the argument you want to make? If you put a parakeet in front of a mirror, unlike an elephant, it doesn't recognize itself. It actually starts singing in the hope that the mirror image will start singing back, and even if the mirror does not sing back, as they tend not to do, it will not realize that there is not a real parakeet out there. Bloody stupid animal, right? But it does experience pain and pleasure. It's very clear that animals like this, birds, can experience pain and pleasure. And if you actually go back to the definition of utility, the original definition, it's about pain and pleasure. Utility is just a fancy economics jargon term for pain and pleasure. Well, for pleasure and of course the absence of pain. That's utility. So if you are a utilitarianist and you argue that it's all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, it's clear that these animals experience that. And perhaps you want to extend some rights towards them as well. And definitely, most of you would feel horrified if there were a parakeet here and I would just take it and break its neck, right, or its back. You would be horrified if I would do that. It sort of seems to suggest that yes, you do attach some moral value to these animals, stupid as they may be. But we're on a slippery slope, right? So now it's about experiencing pain and pleasure. Now, if you take a worm, right, and you cut it in two, if I take you and I cut you in two, then you're dead, right? I have two half-dead humans. If you take a worm and you cut it in two, you have two worms. And the reason for that is that a worm doesn't have a central nervous system as we do, which means that you can cut it in two and it can live on in two parts. And because it doesn't have a central nervous system, it also doesn't experience pain and pleasure the way we do, because that's something that happens in your brain, right? Now, there's also a picture of an octopus here. An octopus does not have a central nervous system. An octopus has 9 brains. A somewhat bigger one in the middle there, and then every one of its tentacles has a separate brain. It is the only way to coordinate 8 arms at the same time without messing up, right? So an octopus does not have a central nervous system like we do. But octopuses are actually very clever animals. So the idea that sort of the central nervous system sets us apart from other beings, this doesn't stand up to biology. So perhaps we should extend rights to these beings as well. Now by now you guys, or perhaps not all of you, think that now you're getting too far, right? Now you're going too far. But if you look at some of the sects in Hinduism, for instance, they argue that every living being has a right, and you can't just go around and kill animals, no matter how lowly those animals may be in our eyes. So this is not an outlandish thought, at least for some people in India, right? But if you look at the biochemistry, it's actually very hard to tell the difference. That is, I mean, you occasionally hear the stories about that life is being discovered on Mars, right? And they say, no, it hasn't, no, it hasn't. And that's because it's very hard chemically to tell the difference between organic matter and living matter. It's actually very hard to draw the line between these two. And if you find organic matter on Mars, is that because there's life on Mars, or maybe it's just organic matter on Mars, right? It's very hard to draw that distinction. And some people would argue that actually rights and duties should extend to all beings. And what you see here is two pictures. One is a lump of coal, and there's definitely people who argue that we should leave natural resources intact because we have no right to disturb them. The other picture that you see is three holy mountains, according to these must be American Indians, and they believe that their ancestors lived there, and that therefore you are not allowed to go in and chop off a piece of this rock. Just as you are not allowed to go in and chop off my arm, you are not allowed to go in and chop off these rocks. May seem outlandish to you, but there's definitely people who argue this, right? And now we're full-blown naturalism, right? The notion that what matters in the moral calculus is not what humans think or what matters to humans, but we have a much more expensive notion of society, right? So that is naturalism. Libertarianism is one of the two schools of humanism. And in humanism, as the name suggests, it's about humans. Right? Libertarianism goes back to Locke at the top. The modern proponent of this is John Nozick, who you see at the bottom. And Locke essentially argued that property is just if it is acquired through labor. So if I go into the forest, I chop down the trees and turn it into a plot of land where you can grow crops, then because I put in the labor, this is my land. Because I transformed it from something useless to something useful. Now that is what Locke argued, and essentially, well, that's the only thing you can say. Now that's very limited, definitely in modern times, right? That's not what we do anymore. We don't go into the forest to chop it down, and well, most of us don't. John Nozick added to this, well, if a transaction is voluntary, then the resulting property holdings are just as well. And everything else is unjust. So libertarianism is all about process. They don't really care where we are. They only care about how we got there. And if we got there through mutual consent, then all is fine, regardless of the outcome, right? And it's all about individual rights and property and liberties. You can do whatever you like except for hurt your neighbor. But as long as you're not bothering other people, it's up to you to do whatever you want. Right? That's what libertarianism is about. There's no concept about consequential justice. There's no idea whatsoever whether to compare two situations, whether they're good or bad. If the route that you cut there is the right one, then the outcome is fine. If property can only change hands by mutual consent, then the immediate implication is that the government cannot tax your income, because that is not by mutual consent. The government takes your money. You did not agree to that. Well, you guys don't pay tax. I did not agree to that. So you sort of like see where the libertarians are, right? This is right-wing America. There should not be a state. Except, of course, and that is what the extreme libertarians argue, but Nozick definitely doesn't argue this. A government does have a role in preventing unjust holdings, theft, essentially. Because property can only exchange hands by mutual consent, and theft is not by mutual consent. A government also has a role in providing public goods, natural monopolies and those sort of things, and in preventing externalities, because an externality is an unintended consequence on a third party. So if you guys by mutual consent decide to do something that hurts me, then you infringe on my rights and my liberties. And the government is allowed to step in. But other than that, unemployment benefits, no way. That's not what a government should do. Stabilize the business cycle, absolutely not. That's not what a government can do, right? Right? That is libertarianism. And as I said, there are people who really believe this. Utilitarianism is another school of humanism. So this is all about humans, and it goes back to Jeremy Bentham, and now he's in place. And it's all about individual pleasure. It's about happiness. It's about avoidance of pain. It's about human well-being at the individual level and at the social level, right? And utilitarianists are also pretty extreme, because they only care about the outcome. They don't care about how you got there. Now, this is the standard position in economics, right? We maximize the social welfare function. We actually don't talk at all about, well, how do you actually do this? Right? It's all about the outcome, and the outcome is the only thing that matters. And this is, of course, a position that has been adopted by the ruling class in Singapore. We don't care about democracy. You guys are rich because of us. Stop complaining. You're rich and you're safe. Stop complaining. You don't have any right to speak up. And of course, this argument is also used in China. It used to be used in Taiwan and South Korea and other places, right? That an authoritarian government, society where you don't have any basic rights of democracy, is perfectly fine as long as they deliver the goods, right? As long as people are healthy, wealthy, and safe. So there's no, in utilitarianism, there's no concept of procedural justice. There's no notion that, well, the decision is the right one if people have been consulted, if people have been informed at least beforehand, if people have had a right to say about these things, or perhaps have a right to vote about things. All that is complete nonsense and completely redundant according to a strict utilitarian. Right? And as I said, this is essentially what you do when you maximize a social welfare function. Now, the schools of utilitarianism, on the next slide, sort of the standard one is that utility is individual and we only care about ourselves, right? Homo economicus. And utility that's the humans only, and then welfare, social welfare, simply is the sum of utilities. There's no reason for that. You can have other utility functions where you actually care about the people around you. You can attach utility to non-humans. You can have some aggregation, which I think is on the slide after next. And this is what economics is about, right? That a situation is Pareto superior to another situation if at least somebody is better off and nobody's worse off. And a situation is Pareto optimal or efficient if there's no more Pareto improvements, right? You have seen these definitions. And this essentially is the same as just adding up utilities and maximizing the sum total. That's the first welfare theorem, right? And we should, of course, distinguish between potential Pareto improvements and actual Pareto improvements. So an actual Pareto improvement is that nobody's worse off and at least one person is better off. A potential Pareto improvement is that some people are initially better off, other people are worse off, but the sum total has gone bigger, and then the winners compensate the losers, so that nobody is worse off again. So a potential Pareto improvement is an actual Pareto improvement after transfers. Problem, of course, with applying potential Pareto improvements is that those transfers rarely happen, right? So an argument that something is potentially Pareto improvement, potentially Pareto improving, does not make it actually Pareto improvement. This is a difficult thing to say. And this, in economics books and articles, people call this Kaldor-Hicks, after Kaldor and Hicks, which is just like, okay, let's put two random names on and see whether your memory gets the right thing there, right? Problem with changing slides is that you wonder where you're going, right? You've seen the fundamental welfare theorems. So, as I just alluded to, a perfectly competitive market, or perfect market, with perfect competition and perfect rationality and complete knowledge, is a Pareto optimum, right? And this is the first fundamental welfare theorem. This was sort of alluded to by Adam Smith, that if we leave everybody to their own devices, it's not the baker does good things because of greed, not because of a higher ideal of what society should do. It was sort of like first shown by Abba Lerner graphically, and that is the proof you may have seen, and it was first shown algebraically by Harold Hotelling, and that's the people you see there. And then the second fundamental welfare theorem is, of course, that any Pareto improvement can be achieved as a perfectly competitive equilibrium with the appropriate reallocation of resources. That is, if we redistribute income, we can still reach the Pareto optimum, but one that would be different and one that may be better, right? The first fundamental welfare theorem, and even if you talk about Pareto optima, right, you can have a Pareto optimum where one or two people are incredibly rich to start with, and everybody else is incredibly poor, and then they can barter a little bit and that sort of stuff, and that would improve their situation. But in the end of the day, after the market reallocates things, you still have the situation that a few are very rich and most are very poor. And that would be a Pareto optimum, right? Even though you would not recognize this as an optimal situation, right? The second welfare theorem is that you can actually just redistribute income and reach another Pareto optimum that you might find more palatable, right? So that is the important thing to keep in mind here. And if you're maximizing utility, start, or maximizing the sum of utilities, starting from the current situation, and we're not necessarily reaching a situation that can be seen as just or equitable, right? We may just be marginally improving on a bad situation. So it's an important thing to keep in mind about Pareto efficiency, that it's optimal given the initial condition. If you disagree with the initial condition, then you would probably also not like the final outcome. And that's something that you need to keep in mind, that Pareto optimum does not mean optimal. And also when you're talking to non-economists who have not seen this material, if you just say, well, this is efficient or this is Pareto optimal, then they may vigorously disagree with you, not because they disagree with the concept of Pareto optimality, but because they do not recognize that we take the initial condition as given, right? And people may just object to the initial condition. Okay, this is where I was going, right? And this is the slide that I expected. So I was talking about utilitarianism, that the sort of the Benthamite utilitarianism, we just add up utility of people, but why would we, right? Essentially what we have is that individual utility UI is some function of the stuff we consume in the broader sense, X, Y, I, sorry, and essentially welfare is just some function, social welfare is just some function of individual welfare. And that function can take up many different shapes. And typically what we do in economic analysis, and what Bentham suggested we do, is that social welfare is the sum of happinesses, of individual happinesses, of individual utility. But there's absolutely no reason why you would do that. I should press this button, and now my computer is gone to sleep. Come on. Right. There's no reason why you would restrict this to the simple sum of utility. Now, Bergson and Samuelson, that's the two gentlemen here, suggested that welfare functions are just any function of individual utility, which is not very helpful to say that, well, it can be anything. So Atkinson, that's the third gentleman that you see displayed here, died last year, unfortunately, before he could win the Nobel Prize, which is a bloody shame, suggested that instead of using the simple sum, you use the generalized sum. And that is the function that you see here, that you raise utility to a power 1 minus gamma, and then you divide it for sanity's sake by 1 minus gamma. And if you put 1 over n in front, then it's just a generalized average, right? Rather than the arithmetic average. And if we then set gamma to 0, we are back with Bentham, right? Because we raise everything to the power 1, that is we don't do anything, and divide by 1, that is we don't do anything. Now, the coefficient gamma here is typically referred to as inequity aversion. And that you may have recognized this, right? If we set gamma to 0, then we don't care about the distribution of happiness. We simply add it up. If we let gamma get bigger and bigger and bigger, then if you apply, then if you take the limit of that, and essentially you put more and more weight on the welfare, on the utility of the worst off, and then perhaps you're in a Rawlsian world. And essentially you take not the sum of utilities, but you look only at the person who is worst off. And of course, if gamma is somewhere between 0 and plus infinity, can be 1 for instance, then we put more emphasis on the plight of the worst off people. And if you apply the rule of L'Hopital, you set gamma equal to 1, and essentially instead of adding utility, you multiply utility. And that, of course, amplifies the people with a lower utility. And that actually goes back to Jacob Bernoulli. That was a guess, there's 3 or 4 Bernoullis, right? But I think this is Jacob. And Bill Ness, right? And just to drive home the point, if you let gamma go to minus infinity, then essentially you're taking the maximum. And then you're in a Nietzschean world, right? In one of his more morose moments, Nietzsche wrote that the whole purpose of creation and life was if only all resources could flow to this one man, then perhaps we could have some happiness in the world, right? If we could just make one person incredibly wealthy, then perhaps there was some happiness in the world. Nietzsche was not the most happy guy to be around. So this is still utilitarianism, but in a broad sense, right? So in the very strict sense, we just add up utilities. We don't care about who is happy and who is not, but we can actually change that to include notions of inequity. I would be remiss and deviating from the book if I also don't talk about Arrow, right? What Bergson and Samuelson assumed is that there can be a social welfare function. But that was before Arrow came along. He was much younger when he did this than the picture that you see. And Arrow showed in 1951, and it came out of his thesis, is that if you have an economy with 2 agents and 3 goods, or 3 agents and 2 goods, or 2 agents and more than 3 goods, or more than 3 agents, more than 2 agents and more than 3 goods, and utility cannot be compared. I cannot know how happy you are, and you cannot know how happy I am. Then there cannot be a social welfare function that satisfies the following axioms. Non-dictatorship, that is, nobody is the boss, right? The social welfare function does not coincide with any individual utility function. It has to be independent of irrelevant alternatives. If you prefer A to B if there's no C, then you prefer A to B if there is a C. The fact that a new technology pops up does not mean that you change your mind about old technologies. It has to be monotone. That is, if I as an individual begin to appreciate A more relative to B, then the social welfare function should also start to prefer A relative more to B. And it has to satisfy the condition of non-imposition. That is, again, a different way of saying non-dictatorship. And it has to be unrestricted domain. That is, the social welfare function can judge anything and everything. It's not that there are some situations where we don't express an opinion. Monotonicity and non-imposition can be replaced by Pareto efficiency. If we want to our social welfare function to have these properties, and all of them seem perfectly reasonable, then there is no way you can aggregate from individual preferences to social preferences. It just cannot be. Which is a sort of a problem for utilitarianists, right? Because we always optimize the social welfare function, knowing full well that in 1951, which is by now a while ago, this brilliant young man called Ken Arrow showed that this just cannot be, right? But we pretend to keep on doing it anyway. So that is one criticism of utilitarianism. Another criticism of utilitarianism goes back to John Rawls. And Rawls argued from a completely different perspective and said what is good or what is just is essentially a democratic concept. It is what everybody unanimously could agree on. And he argued that the only, and that's of course what people remember of John Rawls, he argued that the only way we could make a judgment about these things if we are behind a veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance does not mean that you don't know. It means that you don't know. When you're making a judgment about a society, you don't know what your position in that society will be, whether you're a student or a professor or a prime minister or a toilet cleaner. You do not know what skills you would have in that society, whether you can run fast or not so fast, whether you're good with computers or perhaps not. You would not know that, and you would not know about your attitudes towards life. And only when you don't know these things can you make an impartial decision about whether society is good or bad. And he argued that anybody who would be placed under that veil of ignorance would argue that a society is just only if there's maximum liberty, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't infringe on others. So in that sense, Rawls is a libertarian, right? But he at the same time argues that you can only really have differences in income or resources or assets availability if it makes everybody better off. And if it's attached to position. And he would argue for a very egalitarian society. So GP, who opens her doors at 9 in the morning and closes them at 5, should not make more money than a school teacher who needs to be at school at 9. And yes, the kids come home at 3 o'clock, but she needs 2 hours to prepare afterwards. There's no difference there in the amount of effort that they put in, so why would a doctor earn more? Is what Rawls would argue. And you can sort of argue, well, yeah, but a doctor has studied for longer and that needs to be compensated. That's fine, but not beyond that, right? And a surgeon who is, say, a specialist in shoulder operations should not earn a lot more than a professor because working hours are regular. Yes, the job is occasionally stressful, but there's nothing there. A heart surgeon is a different story because a heart surgeon needs to be available at any time, right? Because those operations are urgent. So you can argue that heart surgeons should earn more, but shoulder specialists not, right? And perhaps bakers who have to be up at 3 in the morning, right, to get your bread to you on time for breakfast. That's a tough job, right? And they make a real sacrifice, and perhaps they should earn more than people who can sleep in the morning. That's what Rawls would say, right? That's not how society is, but that is what Rawls would say. Now, often this is interpreted in a utilitarian way, that Rawls really said we should have an egalitarian society and we should maximize the utility of the worst off, and that's one of the welfare functions that I showed you. Now, Rawls, like Kant, is not the most transparent in his writing, so people disagree whether or not he would have disagreed with that particular interpretation of his work. He has been dead for a while, so we can't ask him. And some people would argue that he would have said the same thing about the intergenerational distribution of things. That part of the veil of ignorance is not just what position you would have in society, but also at what time you would live. And then you can argue that future generations should be treated the same as the current generation. But again, Rawls did not explicitly write about these things, so it's unclear what he would have thought, but a lot of people said that he would have said had he written about this, right? That is what he would have argued, that we would also have an equal intergenerational distribution of well-being. There's other criticisms of utilitarianism. I talked about naturalism, I talked about libertarianism. I talked a little bit about Singapore, right? That utilitarianism is all about the outcome, but it doesn't talk about process. And definitely if you were to listen to the people in Hong Kong at the moment, who are fairly rich and fairly healthy, but not free. And they seem to take issue with that, right? And really what a social welfare function should do is also include a notion of democracy or freedom. And Amartya Sen, who you see displayed here, has been arguing this. Now, it's very hard to stick that into a utility function, right? Because freedom is not an individual concept. It is a societal concept. You live in a free society or you don't, but you share your freedom with others, so it's very hard to stick into a utility function. Maybe it should go in there, maybe it should go into a welfare function, that is hard to say. Standard utilitarianism only considers humans as atoms, right? We only care about ourselves. But of course, that is not true. I would hope that you also care about other people, and that other people care about you. So there is altruism, there's sympathy for others. And Sen also made a point, and this is more a descriptive point than a normative point, is that this notion that people maximize utility is just a poor description of behavior. And he introduced notions of responsibility, he introduced notions of agency. You may observe me in a bar, right? And you may observe me and I walk up to a younger woman and I'm obviously trying to chat her up, right? And the thoughts that would go through your mind is out of his league, sad old loser, things like that, right? Are probably the thoughts that would spring into your mind. Now you can also observe me after class where I walk up to a young woman and obviously chat her up even though she has just taken my class. And then the thoughts that would get into your mind are not out of his league and sad old man, right? But you would get a notion of this is not right and proper. This is abuse of a professor-student relationship. This is abuse of power. And even though the situation is the same, right? A man and a woman. But it's not. And depending on the role we take in society, depending on the role we have in a particular situation, we are expected to behave differently. You are different with your fellow students than with your friends, than with your siblings, than with your friends from high school, than with your parents, right? You are a different person. There's different expectations placed on you on how you behave, and you conform your behavior towards them. Now that is nowhere to be found in the utility function, right? Because the utility function, or the standard microeconomics, says you maximize your utility, and your utility function is always the same. It does not depend on who you're with. But of course it does, right? So in that sense, utilitarianism and microeconomics is a poor description of behavior, and there's more to life than just maximizing some welfare function. Now, the example I gave was a joke, right? I don't do that sort of stuff don't worry. It's to drive home the point. And the final criticism of utilitarianism is, of course, that it may lead to repugnant conclusions. You can take away the resources from a lot of people, give it to somebody else, as long as it makes them happier, that's perfectly fine, right? So, that's where we are. Now, let's apply these things to the notion of sustainability. And sustainability is a core concept in environmental policy, and it's a core concept in environmental economics. And there's various definitions of this, and the best definition, I think, is due to Harriet Taylor Mill and her husband John Stewart. Then it's back to 1857. I've given you two quotes of these people before. The earth must lose that great portion of its flesh and hence its owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a happier or a better population. I sincerely hope for the sake of posterity that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. This is the same as what I said before the break. Mills and Mills argued we should not grow to the maximum. At one point we should stop because there's other things in the world that are important. We should not try and maximize our consumption, and one of the reasons that we should not do so is that this will make future life, posterity, worse off. Now, they did not have children, so this was not a selfish or a sort of extended selfish argument. They really thought about future people in a more abstract sense than their children and grandchildren. Now, this is, I think, the first and the best definition of sustainability. The accepted definition of sustainability is due to Gro Harlem Bruntland and her colleagues, who wrote in 1987 that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So essentially, this says we should live our lives without ruining the lives of the people who come after us. Right? So as a broad concept, it's hard to disagree with this, right? There is, of course, Johnny Rotten. It's better to burn out than to fade away. But most of us would say, oh, this is actually a pretty good maxim. This is how we should live our lives, and this is how society should organize itself. We should not. We should leave a better planet for our children. So this particular concept took the world by storm. Basically, every government strives for sustainable development. Basically, every major company that has sort of goals and missions argues that we should be sustainable. Every organization on the planet essentially ascribes to this notion. And that is because it sort of appeals, right? It's hard to argue against it. But it's also particularly vague, right? It sets out a broad course, but it doesn't specify any particular action that you may object to. It does not say, you shall not eat meat, right? Which is probably good for sustainable development, but a lot of people would not accept that as a prescription, right? Or it does not say that you cannot own a car, even though that's probably good for the environment. Or you should not use plastic straws, even though that's probably marginally good for the environment. No, it does not say that. It talks about needs, but what are needs, right? What do we exactly mean by the present? Is the present represented by Mitch McConnell, or is the present represented by Greta Thunberg, right? No, we just say present. or I should have used the word Donald Trump rather than Mitch McConnell, right? Because most of you are not following American politics as closely as I do. And we should do so without compromising. What does that mean? Does compromising mean doing slight damage, or does compromising mean doing fundamental damage? To the ability of future generations, is that the next generation? Is that the next 10 generations? Is that the next 100 generations? To meet their own needs. And what do we know what the needs of future generations would be? There's a saying in English that the past is a different country, which of course immediately implies that the future is also a different country, or the future will see us as a different country, and they will think completely differently about things than we do. And I'm old enough to recall when gay rights and gay marriage, absolutely not, right? You guys grew up in a society where being homosexual is, what is it actually? We actually need to talk about this, right? But when I was young, you'd better not be a poof, right? Because people would beat you up. So how do, and that's in a time span of 30 years, right? So how do we know what the needs of future generations will be? We can only sort of project our own needs on them, right? It's a very, very dangerous thing to do. Now, but that is the strength of this particular definition. It is not very specific, right? It sets the broad tendency without becoming prescriptive. Now, academics should, of course, have just left this, right, and say, well, it's a wonderful definition, everybody can get behind it. It's pretty clear what direction we should go, but that's it. But of course, academics cannot leave things alone, and they want to put on meaning on this and make it precise, right? So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so, take you through some of the definitions of sustainability, and here we're looking at some of them. Okay, right, now we're deviating. I'm deviating. So Jack Pezzi, who you see here, argued that really what this means, what sustainability means, is that utility does not fall. And that means that we satisfy our needs, the future generations are at least as happy as we are, so they have satisfied their needs, right? So that is really what this means. The problem is, of course, is how do you define utility? So Hardwick, whose picture you do not see, argued really what this means, because you cannot measure utility and we cannot define utility properly. Really, we should be focusing on consumption, does not fall. And then Solo, whose picture you do see, and argue that because of resource limits, really what we're saying is that consumption should be constant over time. You should go to a steady state in consumption. What these arguments do not treat is whose utility are we talking about? Is this the average utility of people? Or is it the utility of every individual that should not fall? Same for consumption. And should this be averaged over decades, or should it be instantaneous utility? Of course, it cannot be instantaneous utility, because if you get a cold, which you will because it's autumn, right? If you get a cold, you feel pretty miserable, right? That is not an affront to sustainability, right? Because you will hopefully recover. So it cannot be instantaneous utility, but it can also not be utility averaged over centuries, because then we ignore things. Then the Great Depression would not have been an issue. So 10 years, is it 1 year, is it 100 years, who knows? So even though it seems to be more precise, it in fact is not really more precise. The key aspects of weak definitions of sustainability is that substitution is allowed. So if you cut down all the trees and put them in the tree museum, right? Then you can still enjoy the natural beauty, and you are just as happy, right? And as long as the utility you derive from observing those trees, whether they're in the wild or in the tree museum, that doesn't matter. And if whales go extinct, but we have pretty good 3D footage of those whales, and we can put you in a virtual reality where you can swim as if you are with the whales, then your utility has not gone down. They actually have gone up, because it's in a virtual reality you're not as cold and miserable as you are in the real ocean where most whales swim. Then that is fine, right? As long as humans are as happy, it doesn't matter how they got that happiness, whether through the real experience or through a virtual experience of the same thing, and probably an improved thing. That is the core aspect of weak sustainability. Some people have said, consumption, what is that? Utility functions, what are those? Really what we should look at are production possibilities, right? So we should not so much focus on the demand side of the economy, but we should focus on the supply side of the economy. Same thing here. What do you really mean by that? But the crucial thing is that substitution is allowed. The alternative to weak sustainability is strong sustainability, as you may have guessed. And there it essentially says that no substitution is allowed, that all natural stocks are inherently valuable. Now, one of these guys is Leopold, and the other guy's name I completely forgot. And this is, of course, Pope Francis, who I do recognize. So this goes back to naturalism. And this essentially says that you cannot take oil out of the ground and turn it into something useful for humans, because you have violated the rights of oil stocks. Most people would not go towards oil stocks, but most people would say, well, you cannot cut down forests and turn them into housing or something, or into grassland to put cows on, because that violates the rules. Now, if that is really your perspective, that all these things have inherent rights, then of course you cannot do anything, right? Because there's nothing you can do as a human that not somehow damages some aspects of nature. So in practice, you have to allow for some form of compensation. And if you're going to cut down a forest here, then by implication, you have to plant new trees somewhere else. And then sort of the total stock of natural land or forestry remains the same. But of course, the newly planted forest cannot be the same as the old forest, because it's at the very least, it's in a different place, and maybe in a different climate, and maybe may have a different ecosystem. It's definitely of a different age, right? You cannot recreate old growth forest, not until you wait for a couple of centuries, right? So you get into these discussions about what substitution is allowed when are forests or wetlands or habitats equivalent. Is it okay to cut down a few trees if you plant? Is it okay to cut down 5 trees if you plant 15 trees, or you have to plant 25 new trees? Is it okay to cut down large areas of forest in Brazil if you're replanting forests in Nigeria? All those are questions that are not really answered by this, right? What stocks do you want to maintain? You say, well, You can't substitute things for other things. What do you really mean? Do you want to preserve nature at a habitat level, at a species level, perhaps at a gene level? And the answers are very, very different. People get upset when I say that polar bears are really brown bears that are white, right? And genetically that is true, and the two can have babies together that are viable and actually fertile. So the polar bear is really just a subspecies of the brown bear and the grizzly bear. And therefore if the polar bear gets lost, well, a lot of genes get lost. That's almost a form of racism, that we care so much more about the white bear than about the brown bear, who is actually identical. So if you're going to argue that we should maintain species or genes, yeah, you can let the polar bear go. As I said, people get upset when I say these things, even though biologically I'm on safe ground here, right? And people actually get upset by the notion that polar bears would be forced from the ice onto the land. Or even though there's evidence that actually they eat better there, their children are, their cubs are healthier, and there's more of them. People say, no, we have to maintain polar bears in their icy environment, because that's how it's always has been, right? So these arguments are very, very difficult, right? And not necessarily well informed by the science. And of course we have the question, what do we do with viruses and pests? If we say, well, we should maintain nature as it is, actually nature used to have smallpox, and fortunately it is almost gone, right? Smallpox is confined to 4 laboratories, 2 in the US and 2 in Russia, and they're safely locked up there, and let's hope to God that they will remain safely locked up there, because you guys, and not me either, have any resistance whatsoever to smallpox, right? We're now in a program to kill malaria, right? Malaria used to kill about 800,000 children every year, and we're now going after that bloody disease, right? That means that we're actively destroying a natural part of the environment. And if you really think that animals and viruses have the same rights as we do, then this is completely the wrong thing to do, right? I would strongly disagree with that, and I am very, very happy that people are going after malaria. Some people say, well, what matters is not so much what nature is, but the services that nature delivers. It does not really matter how water gets filtrated through a wetland, as long as water is filtrated. It does not really matter where baby fish grow up, as long as they have a place to grow up. And if that is your argument, then yeah, sustainability is fine. You have a limited form of substitution. You can replace, say, mangroves with coral reefs, right? Both of which sort of have a function of protecting the coast against waves and storms. Both of which have a function of being a nursery for young fish. So it does not really matter if mangroves are replaced with coral reefs, or coral reefs with mangroves for that matter, because they roughly fulfill the same function. Other people say, no, we need to keep both ecosystems intact, right? So there's lots of definitions of sustainability, right? Where the sort of the starting point is like, leave this planet as least as clean as you found it, but preferably cleaner, to this very sort of like pernickety definitions, and then you get into, so what do you really mean? Now, that is how it used to be. Sustainability used to be seen as something about the environment and something objective, and of course people have jumped on board, and really this is all about what we want it to be, which is of course true. Sustainability is not something that is objectively out there, it's something that constraints that we impose on ourselves. But the people who argue, well, this is all a social construct, then almost always argue immediately following up with saying that what matters is how we define sustainability. And what matters is that everybody has a say in defining what we're going to do with the future of our planet. Right? And it's all about global governance and global democracy, which is a different thing. And this is really getting into, it's no longer about environmental care, it is about how we organize society, not just in our relation to nature and the environment, but it is how we define society also in relation to our role in society and our voice in society. And really what you have here is a political goal getting into this very popular concept of sustainability. As I said, every country, every major organization, every company have signed up to this notion of sustainability. And what happened over the years is that what started off as a debate about the environment became a debate about the environment and everything else. And for a long time, people argued really that there's three pillars to sustainability, and that is there's an environmental component, there is a component about economic growth, that we should try to become richer, and that is definitely true for the 6 billion people on this planet who are desperately poor, and it should be about distributional justice. And really there are these three things that are equally important. So that used to be the case, and then the United Nations got its hands on it, and we now have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and you see them displayed here. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice and strong institutions, partnerships for the goals. Those are the 17 sub-goals of sustainability. If you listen carefully, you would have noticed that none of these actually matter a whole lot. When they were launched, they made a big show. This is Ed Sheeran. You probably don't recognize him. I think the reason that they put Ed Sheeran up there is that he used to be able to sing really, 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 really fast. You may recall some of his earlier albums from when you were younger. And he managed to put all 17 Sustainable Development Goals into a 3-minute song. And here we have them again listed, and poverty in all its forms everywhere. And I've taken you through the list, right? And I'm not going to do an Ed Sheeran, I'm not going to sing for you. And if you think about where sustainability started, it was out of concern for the environment. But if you listen to these things, the ones marked in red are really sort of a traditional labor type of, left-wing type of agenda, and poverty, and hunger, and sure healthy living, gender equality. These are worthy goals, don't get me wrong, but gender equality is not an environmental thing, right? It is important, absolutely, unless it is to do with the environment. There is a blue goal, promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, promote economic growth. That is where the Tories would recognize themselves, right? Economic growth, yay. It's not environmental, right? And it's only when we get lower down the list, and the marks, ones marked in green, that we are talking about environmental care. right? Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, protect and restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, combat desertification, and so on and so forth. Those are environmental goals. What we've seen over sort of from 1987, Bruntland, where the environment, sustainable development was about environmental care. If we moved to the Sustainable Development Goals, I think adopted in 2013, maybe a bit later, environment has basically drifted to the background of sustainability. And the reason for that is very simple. As I said in the beginning, everybody supports sustainable development. So if you are in favor, and I hope you are, in favor of gender equality, and everybody's talking about sustainable development, what are you going to do? You can do two things. Either you can say, well, but gender equality is important too, and we should not just care about sustainable development, and then people say, but you are anti-environment, right? So you've lost the debate. So what do you want to do if you're in favor of gender equality? You want to redefine sustainable development so that it includes gender equality, right? That's a much more fruitful way of lobbying. So that is what people have done. Now, and now I have a slide and you don't. Now there is an issue here, and I'll just put this one up again. And that is the so-called Tinbergen rule. And the Tinbergen rule essentially says that if you want to solve 7 social problems, then you should use 7 instruments. And if you have 13 problems, then you should use 13 instruments. The number of instruments that you as a government or a regulator use should be the same as the number of problems you're trying to solve. Now, Tinbergen wrote this first up in 1951. Tinbergen is, of course, the first Nobel laureate in economics, shared Nobel laureate in economics. What he said was entirely unremarkable, because this follows immediately from Lagrange's axioms on optimization, right? If you have an objective function and there's 7 stock variables in there, then you would have 7 first order conditions to solve those 7 things, right? The number of first order conditions has to match the number of issues you're trying to solve. And if you have more than them, you have a problem. If you have fewer than them, you have a problem as well, right? So an intuitive way of thinking about this is if you have 2 bikes, you have 2 steering wheels. Let's say, how do you call them? On the bike, right? That is what you want, because if you have 2 bikes and only 1 people steering, that is fine as long as you're going straight, but if you want to take a turn, one of them will fall over, right? If you have only 1 steering wheel. And similarly, if you have 2 people on a bike and both of them are steering at the same time on a single bike, then chances are you won't get very far because you will fall over, right? So if you have 2 things that you want to control, you need 2 things to control them. So that is the situation you want to be in. And if you care about the environment and you care about gender equality, then you need to have a set of policy instruments that goes after gender equality, and you need to have a set of policy instruments that go after, say, CO2 emissions. Now that is a pretty obvious thing, but if in your mind everything sort of gets merged and everything is about sustainability, then you may get into the situation where you think, well, if I solve one problem, then I've solved them all. And it's just muddied thinking, right? By putting everything under the same header, you run into problems. And there are real trade-offs here, and earlier today I alluded to particulate emissions, right? There is a real trade-off here. If you want to reduce CO2 emissions, then yes, switching from petrol to diesel is a good idea, but if you want to reduce particulate emissions, then you want to switch from diesel to petrol, right? So these two environmental problems, climate change and particulate emissions, these are both real problems, have an opposite solution, right? And if you say, oh, we just want to improve sustainable development, you lost that distinction. And the same is true for environmental care and social justice, right? So a lot of our environmental problems are associated with agriculture. I talked about eutrophication before. And a lot of our environmental problems are associated with energy use. Particulate matter is one, CO2 emissions is another. Now, food and energy are necessary goods. So if you're going to switch to alternative fuel sources, and you're going to force society to switch to those things by making fossil fuels more expensive, or you're going to tell farmers that they can no longer oversupply phosphates and they should store their manure rather than just dump it on the land, then you're making farm operations more expensive, and that means that you're making food more expensive. So if you're worried about those environmental problems associated with energy or agriculture, then you're making energy more expensive and you're making food more expensive, and those are necessary goods. And necessary goods essentially means that poor people pay a larger share of their income towards these than rich people do. So these policies necessarily are regressive. That is, if you make energy more expensive, if you make food more expensive, then you're going to hit the poor harder than you hit the rich. And there's no two ways about it, right? So there again, your social policy of progressive taxation and all that sort of stuff immediately contradicts your environmental policy. And you should be careful there. And just calling things sustainable development hides those contradictions. And therefore you should be very careful in just changing labels and just pretending that everything is a win-win situation. I'm not saying that you should not solve environmental problems if they hurt the poor harder than the rich, because they're sort of alternative policies that you could use to counteract those negative social consequences of your environmental policies, and you should use them, but you should be aware of them, and being aware of them starts by acknowledging that there's 2 different issues or 15 different issues that each have their own solutions and each have their own pros and cons, and you should be cognizant of those. And the starting point with that is acknowledging that different problems have different names and therefore different solutions, right? And just calling everything sustainable development is just a dangerous thing to do. That's all I wanted to say for today. So, next Tuesday, in the seminar, we're going to talk more about these issues that I just talked about, starting with a problem set that is not really a problem set, but much more read them and think about how you would talk about these. It's not 2 + 2 is, right? It's not a traditional mathematical problem set. So that's the seminar, and then the I've lost my train of thought. The lecture from 3 to 5 past will be about externalities in public goods, right? So the seminar will be about social choice, discussing a number of problems, and then the lecture will be about externalities in public goods. And the idea of a seminar is that you guys talk more than I do, right? Okay, I see you guys next week.